Hi, so we're starting a new unit this week and thinking about, again, the transition from Nishime's text to this particular text, thinking about the idea of actually not just creating culture, but also the idea of how does one create a cultural history, actually recreating the idea of one's own nation's history, which is why when we look at Gonzalez's book is really about paying attention to that process, that the Philippines themselves have to go through this process of creating and recreating what they consider to be their cultural history, and how that then comes out in the ultimately in the performance of something like a Filipino Cultural Night in the 1970s and 1980s on college campuses, and then how do then students, more recent years take that particular model, the PCN, and then constantly remake it. So there's a couple of key points for this particular unit these upcoming weeks. First off, we want to really understand the idea of how Gonzalez is approaching the idea of the Filipino Cultural Night. And the idea is that he's using it as an example for thinking about how, in this case, specifically Filipino-American students, but in general, think about the idea of how people perform their notions of cultural identity. How do they actually sort of, in this particular moment, obviously because they are performers, putting on this particular act of what it means to be Filipino-American, but that's also a kind of a metaphor for a larger idea of, well, how do people identify and be, Filipino through this particular process? And the idea that these are not just natural processes, these are things that are in fact, taken on, they are, invented. And this is really kind of this idea of, what he wants us to think about in terms of the genealogy, right? The idea of a genealogy is starting from the current moment and working backwards almost, and trying to trace all these and where these particular things come from. And so one of the things for especially the readings for this week, prologue through chapter 2, is really thinking, well, how is he trying to get us to understand how the Philippines themselves, especially in the aftermath of independence from the United States, right, in the 1940s, 1946 to be precise, start to actually recreate and build a notion of a national identity as Filipinos. And alongside of that, how the culture then is going to be part of this larger narrative of what it means to be Filipino in the years going forward after 1946. Right? Because this is, again, a nation that's recovering from and sort of emerging from almost 4 centuries of, colonialism and imperialism, right? First by the Spanish and then later by the United States. Another key concept we have to pay attention to, and this is something I really want you to think about, and this is one of the things we'll think about in the discussion questions, is understanding how the idea of a tradition itself, right? We think about all these different traditions that we might have, cultural traditions, things that we do, sort of on a daily basis, or things that we do, sort of to celebrate holidays, recognize these particular moments, that these particular traditions are in fact invented. Someone had to create them. They have a starting point. They don't just simply emerge because people collectively agree, okay, this is what we're going to be doing. There is this particular moment of, that they are new. And the process is, what happens with traditions is that over a certain period of time, we lose that notion of why these traditions become created, and they become naturalized, right? We've been doing these things because we've always been doing these things, rather than think about, well, okay, why do we start doing these things? And again, this is that idea of the genealogy that Gonzalez wants us to think about. How do we start to look at something like the Filipino Cultural Night as not a tradition just that gets sort of passed on from year to year to year to year with college students, but the idea of, well, where do we get the idea to actually start the process in doing these particular dances as being part of Filipino? And this is part of the entire larger question that he wants us to start to unpack through his text. So again, keep in mind that this is something that is specific to his text in terms of thinking about Filipino Cultural Night, but a larger thing that we want to consider as well in terms of, why do we do the things that we do as Asian Americans or Asian Pacific Americans or as Chinese Americans or as Japanese Americans or as Japanese or as Korean, right? Those are the questions that we can think about in terms of considering, well, okay, why are those the traditions? Where did they come from? And lastly, and this is again something that we'll be wrapping up when we finish up the particular text, is thinking about the idea, well, how do traditions change, alter, even though we might consider the idea of tradition as being, inflexible, something that remains almost static throughout time, because the idea of tradition is this idea of timelessness. But in reality, that tradition itself is constantly being reinvented. It's adapting. It's shaped by things like market forces, right? It's shaped by things like technology, technological influences, and the idea of how do then we modernize these things, and what does modernization actually mean, right? And we can think about the idea of futuristic, imaginings as well from the previous weeks. But it's really the idea of, well, how do we take these traditions and, even though intentionally or unintentionally, start to modify them because of certain conditions that exist. And this is one of the things we'll look at when we look at the PCN. And as we wrap up, right, how do PCNs start to incorporate much more contemporary forms of culture that maybe didn't exist in that original notion of what quote-unquote Filipino culture actually entailed. So first off, I want to really emphasize the reading schedule and how we want to do the reading, because Gonsalves's textbook may be a little bit more complicated, but there's a couple of things I do want to make sure that you understand. That as we look, and for this week, I would like you to read from the prologue through the end of chapter 2, which is about 80 pages. And really, these first two chapters really start to cover the idea of where do we get the idea of Filipino culture as we understand it today. And so he looks through these particular historical processes. And largely, these are also political processes, because the idea of creating culture is also built up into the idea of how do we celebrate, recognize the idea of a national identity. So those things are not necessarily separated from each other. They are, in fact, conscious in terms of how do we get to the different elements, right, the different suites that will become part of the PCN in the 1970s and 1980s, and the fact that, these things are then part of a specific project by the Filipino government to say, this is really how we see what Filipino means. It's not just exclusive in terms of, one type of language, one type of heritage, right? But really sort of dealing with all these different, histories that go into and form, what it means to be Filipino. Next week, we're going to be reading chapters 3 and 4, and chapters 3 and 4 really do talk about specifically, well, then how does the PCN and the idea of the PCN make its way from the Philippines back into the United States and then get readapted in the United States in places like on college campuses, specifically with the UCLA Filipino Cultural Night, which is one of his case studies, one of the things he looks at specifically. And so that week also, I'm going to give you some links to more contemporary PCNs that you'll see on college campuses, one from UC Berkeley, and be prepared, right? I'm not going to ask you to watch all of them, but if anyone is familiar with the PCN at Long Beach State, it's not an anomaly. The link I'm going to provide to you on YouTube through Beachboard is for a program that is 3 hours long, and that's a pretty solid 3 hours. And so it's split up into 2 sections. Again, you don't have to watch all of it, but you should watch enough of it so that you get a sense of what the PCN is like, and I'll provide you with links with shorter ones as well. But to really understand, right, what the Filipino Cultural Night is about. Of course, the other side of it is that in the narrative of chapters 3 and 4 is thinking about, well, what do students actually do in preparation for and participating in the Filipino Cultural Night. And the last, and so the following of that, we're going to be wrapping up the discussion of Gonsalves's book, when that's chapter 5 and the conclusion. That's really short. So chapters 3 and 4, chapter 5 and the conclusion are actually fairly short. So the reading's going to start tapering down quite quickly. But chapter 5 really starts to think about, well, how do things like parody, right, the idea of humor, how does that start to then, affect and influence the way people think about the PCN in more recent years. And also the idea of memory, which is part of his conclusion, and thinking about the idea, or the epilogue, the idea of, well, what remains when we think about those ideas of separation and anxiety. So it's a much more theoretical conclusion. So it's something we'll talk about a little bit more in those weeks. But for the discussion question, there's really only one major question that I want you to address for the discussion for this week, and that's really thinking about your own experiences and thinking about your own family. And again, this is whether or not you're, identify as Asian American, Asian Pacific American. But thinking about that idea of specific cultural practices, again, they can be creative cultures like dance, like music, or things that you do on a daily basis like rituals, right, in terms of holidays, celebrations. But what are those ones that you specifically, you or your family perform to maintain any kind of connection to a non-U.S., non-American cultural identity? So thinking about things like, this is what we do on, Thanksgiving, to be American, but maybe what you do on Thanksgiving that is sort of this idea that we're weaving in parts of our quote-unquote Asian American identity, or what have you. So identify those, and then think and explain. Well, why do you do you think that it's important that you do this? Is it something that you really think is important to recreate, something that you might want to pass on to, children if you eventually have children, or that you feel that something that if you have nephews, nieces, right, other future generations that you'd like to pass on to, or maybe it's something that really only your parents or maybe your uncles, grandparents really sort of hammer home so that you participate because they are there. Discuss that particular idea. What's the value that you place in preserving and replicating these particular practices for future generations? So that's the point of the discussion question for this week. Okay. So, lastly, the paper assignment. And I'm giving you the paper assignment very, very early this time because it is something that I'm asking you to do a little bit more research. Remember the last paper assignment, you were asked to watch a television show and discuss and analyze that. This is similar to that, except that what I'm asking you to do is to, if you can, attend in person an Asian Pacific American cultural event or performance. Again, there's going to be a calendar provided on Beachboard with a list of local events. A lot of them are going to be actually Japanese American carnivals and what they call Ondo, which is dances, or Obon festivals, which is their autumn festival, and to observe them. And there's going to be, throughout July is really the month for that, so this is the reason I'm letting you know about this now, so that if you want to, you can plan and go accordingly. Or if for some reason that you have other events that I didn't list, you can certainly pitch those to me. Can I go to this and watch this? It is something where you're going to be much more observing what's going on at this particular event. And so one of the reasons I want you to think about it is because obviously these are time sensitive. You can't go back in time and see something if it doesn't exist there. For those of you who are unable to attend an event in person, you can then also choose, if you like, watch a pre-recorded APA cultural event or performance that's existing on YouTube. What I would like you to do is to stay away from PCNs, because obviously PCNs are going to be something that we're going to be talking about specifically with Gonzalez's text. But there are other cultural nights as well that are recorded and are available on YouTube. Cambodian cultural nights, Vietnamese cultural nights, so college, cultural nights, they do exist on YouTube, so you can watch those as well. And again, that means that you're going to have to search on them yourselves. I'll provide a couple of links for some sample ones, but if you find one that you want to watch and write about, you just need to make sure you email me, get approval from me. You can also do things like Paris by Night. Paris by Night is specifically Vietnamese American celebration. It's kind of a one-night performance that started out in the 1980s when that was circulated primarily through videotapes, but now they have them more frequently, and they have performances in places like Pachanga and casinos and local theaters. And you can also get them on YouTube. The issue with something like Paris by Night, however, is that's all performed in Vietnamese. There's very little English in some of the performances. And if you watch any of these YouTube videos and you see the interviews with some of the performers, they themselves don't even speak Vietnamese. They're just sort of going through the motions, and they can mimic Vietnamese, but they don't actually understand what they're singing. So it's kind of a unique dynamic with Paris by Nights. So keep that in mind if you choose to do something on Paris by Night. But again, so this is the first part. So this is one of the reasons I'm telling you about it now, so that you can go ahead and plan, make sure that you start to watch it. Again, similar to the previous paper, I'm going to ask you to analyze, discuss, and evaluate the cultural performance aspect of it. Thinking about what ideas are being communicated, what concepts, what histories, what identities are being actually performed through this particular performance during the event. What songs do they sing? What costumes do they wear? What's the story that they tell? These are the kinds of things that you can then cite as your evidence in terms of this is what's going on with this particular performance. And obviously what I'm like you to do is to think about, as you're reading Gonsalves' text, to use it as kind of an inspiration to think, well, how do I analyze something that people are performing, and how do they perform their own quote-unquote ethnic identity, cultural identity, what have you, through these particular performances. And so again, it's a short paper, it's 750 to 1250 words, and it will be due the last week of class right before your final exam is due. So again, you'll get the more details of the prompt that's going to be available on Peachboard. So that's it for part 1. So as we come back for part 2, we'll talk more specifically about thinking about Gonsalves' textbook and what to do for the reading in preparation for that.